Every ETF has a story, and some of them deserve to be told. ETF Stories from Resilient Advisor brings you some of the most interesting stories from the world of ETFs. Learn more by visiting etfstories.com.
Thanks for tuning in to this episode of ETF Stories from Resilient Advisor. My name is Jay Coulter, and joining me today is Eric Qian of Emles, and we're going to talk about the LUXE ETF. Eric, let's get started at a high level. What is the investment philosophy behind the LUXE ETF?
Yeah, Jay, thanks so much for having us. LUXE is one of our favorite products in our lineup today, and we believe that the luxury goods sector is a really pronounced subsector within the overall consumer discretionary category. And, look, we think there are a lot of fundamental characteristics over time that'll make a really compelling investment case around it.
So how do you define a luxury good through your investment lens?
Yeah, absolutely. So, first things first, we take a look at it through kind of a macroeconomic perspective, right? Luxury goods, by the textbook definition, carry what's known as the Veblen effect, right? So as demand goes up, price goes up. And we see this across, any number of luxury goods offerings within, from the names in the portfolio. That, combined with a number of kind of regional propensities to spend, regional propensities to consume, all in all makes for a fantastic investment case across names that we hold in the portfolio.
All right, well, let's get into the meat of it then. What is the investment process when you're trying to allocate to the space?
Yeah, absolutely. So, today, the portfolio is pretty well diversified across, a number of luxury goods categories, right? That we, that we've kind of determined here at Emles. Number one, all of these are available on our fact sheet, which is available on our website. Those categories today are mostly goods categories, right? With a large allocation consumer discretionary, just to rattle off a couple, right? We've got spirits, e-commerce, diversified holdings, beauty, automobiles, right? Luxury automobiles making up, more than $500 billion of market capitalization. And then finally, apparel and accessories, which, it's a direct relation to that subsector.
Okay. And so when we talk about investment process and portfolio construction, they can kind of blend together, but help the advisors and investors that are listening to this episode understand what your team goes through when looking at those sectors and building out the index and thus the ETF.
Yeah, absolutely. So, we take a real, almost an active approach, right? With a lot of fixed count indexes, typically it might be, something that's ranked over time, ranked based on reference date, right? But, the first thing we look at is the number of kind of offerings, available just to the luxury category, right? Today, just beyond goods, there's luxury experiences as well, right? Now, that said, luxury experience.
To make sure, luxury experiences. What does that look like?
Yeah, like travel, leisure, in luxury kind of destinations, kind of maybe like resorts, and first class flights at some of the more boutique airlines, things like that. All of that carries an overlay that's correlated with luxury spending and luxury consumption by the end of the day. Now that said, that kind of the luxury experience also carries an overlay that's very sensitive to global reopening, right? And today we believe that reopening, that our conviction around that reopening is frankly a bit weaker than our conviction around the goods category, right? The goods category, when I think about the goods category, first off, we recognize that there's an outsized allocation of consumer discretionaries, right? When I think about consumers, number one, the first thing you have to consider is the consumer base that you're appealing to, right? The base, as it boils down to things like income, right, and how those factors represent sensitivity to things like consumer data, right? For example, when we think about the concept of marginal propensity to consume, right, that's a function of consumption over time against your disposable income, right? Frankly, the consumer category that approaches luxury goods should hopefully have that disposable income to back up a lot of the sales. And thus, I think there's a great deal to be said there that perhaps the sector isn't as sensitive to consumer data as one might think it is, right? And I think, the next kind of pillar I usually consider when it comes to consumers is, the ability for the issuer to price their goods, right? And this, rattles back at the Veblen effect we spoke to earlier, right? Consumer discretionary is a huge, sector. When we do our research across, different geographies, for example, Korea is actually geography we excluded recently. But when you look at, the top names in that category, you see everything from car makers, right, to tire makers, to, some names that might even have material overlays, right? A lot of those don't fall in the luxury goods category. And therein is the pricing power, right? The ability for the company to pass on, things like inflation, right? Inflation, to cost of labor, inflation, to materials. All of those things, frankly, are easily passed on to the consumer. And, frankly, many consumers are happy to pay for it.
So this is a global portfolio, correct?
Yes, sir.
And you just mentioned that you guys have excluded South Korea recently. What causes a region or country to be excluded from the index? And then what would cause them to be invited back in?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And, look, their answers, all the way from back office to front office, right? Let me put it that way. But from, an investment perspective, I think today we believe we can properly represent the global sector without an allocation to Korea, right? Frankly, some of those names have suffered, in the wake of kind of regional headwinds to equities, regional headwinds to their currency, and a lot of, geopolitical tensions that, have taken revenue out of a lot of those names.
Okay. So today, as you look at the index and thus the ETF, how much exposure is domestically here in the United States versus international?
Yeah, that's great, question. So, as of September 30th, I think we had about 30% exposure to issuers domiciled in the U.S. Now, and I think, there's something that, people should be careful not to conflate, right? Exposure to, the incorporation or domicile of the business, as opposed to exposure to, geographies of consumers. Right, that's a huge one, right? When you think about names like Kering, LVMH, Richemont, right? These are all names for which we have a profound kind of thesis around corporate consolidation and things like that, right? It's a very value-driven thesis. But then you take a look under the hood, right? These are European EMEA incorporated names which have a huge consumer base in China, right? And that propensity to spend, as defined by, traditional formulas, is huge in China, right? I think, one of the very surprising takeaways, even more so than, it was taken away in the US, was a huge spread between, Chinese urban aggregate wealth or Chinese urban, disposable income, savings, wealth, as compared to the aggregate figures of the nation.
Tell me more about that. What was surprising and how did that play into the investment thesis here?
Yeah, absolutely. So, it goes back to the consumers that we're looking to appeal to, right? As someone who lived in China for a little bit, life in Chinese urban centers is not inexpensive, right? The ability to not only, shelve off your income for basic living expenses, but then to save as well, I think, is well correlated with the massive amount of opportunity in those urban centers as well. Right. Today, when we talk about, when we maybe compare exposures, between the issuers and, the consumer base, right, we look at the basket as of September 30th, there's 57.5 exposure to European issuers. That's pretty large, right? But across the board, there are names, names like Burberry that have an outsized exposure to China, right? Names like Burberry, if I'm not mistaken, have, about a 50% revenue exposure to China, right? In aggregate between, Kering, Richemont, and LVMH, I would say that consumer exposure is no less than 25%.
To China?
Yes, China alone.
Got it. And then do you have the data on where the rest of the consumer exposure is coming from?
Not offhand, but it goes without saying that the U.S. consumer remains, very strong and very important, right, to a lot of these names. I think, especially as this morning's, retail data came out, right, a lot of people remind us that, do not bet against the consumer, right? They will always, carry a large part of the economy on their back.
Okay. So let's talk about some of the holdings inside of Lux as we're recording this.
Yeah.
What are 3 or 4 of the names that have really caught your attention that you think, advisors and investors should be aware of?
Yeah, absolutely. And as mentioned earlier, we take a very diversified approach to the luxury goods issuers that we hold today, right? So, when I look at the top holdings, it's really, good potpourri of different issuers to, different kind of subsectors, right? Good sectors. First one's Daimler, right? Tesla. Those two are both, automakers for which, they've got a great luxury presence. Next is Diageo, right? Diageo and a number of other kind of spirits names make up about 10% of the portfolio. And then, maybe let's just go down to the top 5, right? Fast Retailing and Luxottica, right? Both names that have, an international footprint, but representing, 2 very different kind of segments within luxury goods, right? Luxottica is obviously, the storied sunglasses, accessories conglomerate. And then you've got Fast Retailing, a number of kind of, I think of them as consignment names, right? They fall under our e-commerce category. And look, secondhand luxury is a huge thing. It makes up a big part of the market. And the way we look at it, it carries a lot of, similar pricing power as, the primary retailers.
Okay. So then, given everything that you have described about this ETF, I have some thoughts as to where it should fit inside of a portfolio, but I want you to go first. Where do you see Lux fitting in a portfolio?
Yeah, absolutely. So, look, given the outsized allocation of consumer discretionaries, I think it's natural that, this product sits as, a healthy substitute to your traditional, discretionary allocation. Right, our back tests have shown that it represents a tremendous spread above your traditional allocation, both in terms of price performance and look, things like corporate consolidation drive a lot of stuff under the hood too, right? In terms of gross marginal capacity, right? But by the end of it, right, names like the 3 conglomerates I spoke to earlier literally represent an outsized dedication, outsized obligation from a market cap perspective to maintain those margins, right? And that's where we think the value is going forward.
Yes, Eric, in preparing for this interview, I couldn't agree with you more. If it's squarely as something that somebody could consider as part of their consumer discretionary allocation. Before we wrap up, I'd be remiss. You guys have a great shop with a great ETF product lineup. Any other ETFs you think people should put eyeballs on?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Recently we've we launched an active product. Among the products I manage, we're very keen on a product with ticker AMER. It's called the Made in America ETF. And look, this is a fantastic product that captures the capacity of American manufacturing to contribute to American GDP. Right? If there ever was a patriotic pitch, there it is. And the way we look at it is that indirectly, it's a real pitch to the productivity of the American labor force, right? I think most macro economists, would suggest that, over time, that, we're probably, at the brink of perhaps a labor shortage, right? A contraction of the overall labor base. And when we think about, manufacturing contribution to GDP, it's a simple, direct relationship between labor base and productivity. And in terms of where our bets are, I think it's pretty obvious.
Excellent.
The latter.
For podcast listeners, learn more about the full lineup by visiting emles.com, EMLES.com. That is EMLES.com. Eric, thank you so much for coming on.
Likewise. Thanks so much, Jay.